Hey guys, welcome to Latter-day Bridge Builders. I'm Stevie. This is my third time being on the podcast. I'm co-hosting today because Mitch and Ashton are out of town. So Jules, as the guys call her, has invited me to come on here and talk about our conversion experiences. I'm a convert who joined the church when I was 19, and I have stayed in the church after a faith crisis. And Jules is a convert.
I joined the church when I was 16, and then I disaffiliated around the time I was like 32, 33. And I'm like 38 now.
So you were in for a long time.
I was in for a long time.
A long time. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been in almost as long as you have.
What year were you baptized?
I was baptized in 2014.
Oh.
So I'm like, no, that's not even close.
I was baptized in 2004.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were in for 16 years.
Yeah, pretty
I've been in for... Is that 16 years?
12 years.
12
years. If it
12,
was
yes. I can't do math at
Yeah.
9 o'clock in the morning. But yeah, so we're just we have on both of our social medias, we asked people to ask us questions about the convert experience. So yeah, that's just what we're going to be talking about today. I'm really excited to hear Juliet's story because I haven't heard that yet. My story, I've already shared my experience on this podcast. It's actually the very first episode on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't listened to that yet, go ahead and listen to it.
Yeah. And today we're going to touch on like some of maybe like the trickier questions about being a convert. Like Stevie and I have both experienced like what people might call like a faith crisis and have kind of like not landed at the exact same place, at least like for right now. But I'm like very much in like the deconstruction space. And I often find that I can actually feel kind of isolated as a convert here. And there's a lot that people just kind of take for granted. And so we just wanted to talk about like some of that stuff today. Do you want to just like jump into this awesome list of questions from Ashton that he sent over, and we can just kind of like go back and forth and then maybe get into like some of the longer, deeper ones and then kind of fill in the gaps like before we close up. The first question, did you have any concerns before joining? I would say I had the concern. I felt I didn't investigate for very long. I investigated for about a month and a half, but I definitely was concerned about whether or not I was doing the right thing. Like I really wanted to, like join the right church. And like, if God was real, I wanted God to be like happy with my decision. And so I felt that concern. But I think the other like the concerns that sort of left me out of the church as far as like church history or like just like other kind of cultural concerns or like concerns with like how the church is run. I didn't really have like any of those at the time.
So you were 16 years old. Did you hear like anything negative about the Mormons?
I heard a little bit. Like for example, I heard people say like, oh, they think they can get like their own planets, which now I realize that that's like a pretty complex conversation, right? It's not as simple as like, oh yeah, we all think we're going to be entitled to our own planet. And that's like doctrine that we hear every Sunday. Like it's not as simple as that, but it's also not as simple as like, oh, that has no basis.
And like, it's not as simple as that's not true. Because like, if you read the scriptures, if you read the Doctrine and Covenants, you will find language that does support that. You will find it. And so that is really hard though too, because there is so many like, oh, that is so weird kind of a thing. I heard a lot of negativity. So I was born and raised in Utah. My mom, so I'm adopted. My mom was actually raised LDS, and we would now in 2026, we would consider her childhood to consist of religious abuse. But at the time she was like, oh, my parents were just really, really strict. And, they were just like uber religious. But now looking in 2026 eyes, we're like, no, mom, like you were religiously abused and that's not okay either. So to me, it makes sense why she had her records removed from the church. And it makes so much sense to me why she didn't want me to join, because my parents, like one of my concerns with joining the church. So for those of you that don't know, I looked into the church for like 7 years. I went to girls camp. It was my first sleepaway camp ever. And it started because I read in a book about sleepaway camp and I was like, that sounds fun. I want to try it, even though I hate camping. And so, but my mom was like, yeah, sure. Like there's this thing called girls camp with the LDS church. Like, I guess you could try that. So I went to it and like, it was an okay time. It was fine. But from that point on, the missionaries were like at my door every couple months, and I'd had family members who were excommunicated before as well, but I didn't know this until I was like after I had joined the church, like after I was an adult. But I had a cousin who was gay, and they later came out as transgender, and now they're living a wonderful life as far as I know as a woman. But that was such a hush-hush conversation in our household. Like, my mom was like, no, we don't talk about this person. Like, we just don't talk about it. And I was like, well, why not? Like, you're telling me that this is a bad thing, but that, like, you love them so much, but we're not allowed to talk about it, and we're not allowed to ask questions. Like, I'm so confused with it. But this cousin of mine was excommunicated because they were continuing to live the lifestyle that they chose to live. And it wasn't until I had married my husband where he's like, no, listen, like, excommunications aren't just like thrown out willy-nilly. It's like, here's where you're going wrong. Here's where we want you to be if you want to continue to be a member of the church, but like, here's your choice. And you're continuing to choose to go down this path. And in our spiritual eyes, that's like going to damn you to hell. So we're going to excommunicate you. We're going to break all these bonds that you have spiritually to the church. And like, you're scotch-free. That was always my understanding afterwards. Like, now I've learned a lot more about the process of excommunication, and like, it's a whole other topic for another episode. But so I feel like I experienced a ton of negative experience with members. And I also had people remove their kids from their carpool. I had people say their kids couldn't play with us anymore because we weren't Mormon. Like, I had a lot of really, really negative experiences. And I continue to have negative experiences with members of the church. It just is what it is. You're going to experience it everywhere.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it sounds like you almost like maybe ended up joining the church like in spite of your experiences with members. Whereas we were just talking beforehand, like, all of my experiences with members of the church were extremely positive. And so it's not that I joined the church because of members, but I mean, well, I would say that was a factor, is that that I felt like all of my experiences with members of the church were really, really positive. And so for me, there was like, there was like a connection, or it made sense. Like, oh, if everybody I know that goes to this church is like so nice, so honest, so wholesome, so easy to be around, then surely like there's something there, which is so funny, because obviously so many people, especially people who grow up like in Utah or other like heavily LDS places, like that would not be their assessment, that like all members are super easy to be around.
The thing that's so interesting about that too, though, is like, my experiences changed when I moved out of the Salt Lake Valley, because I joined when I was in college, and I moved to a tiny rural area. And the people there who were Mormon were genuinely like salt of the earth, the kindest, like you said, just the kindest, most honest, awesome people ever. And that's like a thing here in Utah. It's like, oh, there's the Utah County bubble, or there's the Salt Lake like Mormon bubble, like you're so stuck in it. So, like, it's a thing. It's a quantifiable, studyable thing to see that like the Mormon culture in Salt Lake County and Utah County is completely different than like Sanpete County or Juab County, like it really just depends, I think, on where you're at, and just the culture changes everywhere. But then you compare it to California Mormons or Mississippi Mormons or Texas Mormons, like the culture is just so different, but like we all belong to the same church. And I think that's what I have a hard time with, is because I'm like, why can't we just move out of Utah? Like, why can't we just go and be where we're not with those people who are so judgmental? And it's hard. Yeah. So like, that was one of my concerns, was my family pushback. But in terms of like spiritual concerns, I was way concerned about like prophets, and I was really concerned about like the temple, and I was really concerned about Joseph Smith, because before I joined the church, like in my senior year of high school, I secretly read the Book of Mormon. Like, I literally was under my covers with a flashlight. Like, I would get up before anybody in my household, and I would read a chapter before I went to school, and I would read a chapter before I went to bed. Like, I was studious, and I read the entire Book of Mormon. And I didn't want my family to know. And in my senior year, like I mentioned, I checked out books from the library on like anything Mormon that I could find. Like, there's a book called Mormonism for Dummies, and I literally checked that book out and I read it, because I was like, I am so interested in this church, because I had broken up with a guy who read the Book of Mormon, and his family, they weren't Mormons. They come from polygamy, and which we're going to talk about. But part of the reason why we broke up is because we just believed different like spiritual beliefs, and his family was like really steadfastly like the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, like that is gospel. And so I read the Book of Mormon and I was like, what is so great about this book? Like why is this such a rift in our relationship? So I read the Book of Mormon and I did Moroni's challenge, and I learned for myself that it was true, but I was just kind of like, okay, whatever. Like I closed the book and never opened again until I went to college. But I read the Book of Mormon trying to find out more about Joseph Smith specifically, because everything negative that I'd read from the public library books was like based on polygamy, and like Joseph Smith was a bad person, and like he did this and he did that and he did this. And I did not find anything out about Joseph Smith reading the Book of Mormon. And I was so frustrated. I was like, I just spent so much time reading his book and it says nothing about him. Yeah. I was so frustrated. But then at that point I was like, I just don't even care anymore. But when I met with the missionaries, I had a lot of concerns. I was like, I can't join this church until I know about Joseph Smith, until I know about prophets, until I know about like a few other things. I don't remember what all my other concerns were, but I remember praying to God about it. And I was like, God, I can't join this church until I know, like I have to know. And the answer I kept getting from God was like, you'll know in time. And at the time I was like, good enough for me, dude. And I still don't know. I still don't know in time. Like, I don't know when the time is, but I still don't know about Joseph Smith. Like, after going through my faith crisis, like I read the unapproved books, like the anti-Mormon content about Joseph Smith. And so I learned about, Fanny Alger. I learned about him marrying 14-year-olds. And I read both sides because I was like, it's not very genuine for me to only read the anti-Mormon content. And it's not very genuine of me to only read the positive church-approved sources either. So I'm going to read both of them. Mm-hmm. And I still don't know. Yeah. I think like what I honestly chalk it up to is I think that like overall, I think he was trying to do the best that he could at the time that he had, just like all of the other prophets, like from the Old Testament as well. Like a lot of the Old Testament prophets really screwed up too. So I'm like, I don't know. But at the time, it was like, at the time where I wasn't interested in joining the church, it was like, okay, that's weird, but it doesn't have any effect on me because, they're not doing that now. And same thing with some of the other things like we're going to talk about, like with polygamy and with race and the priesthood and blacks in the priesthood and all these other things, is at the time before I joined the church, I was like, oh, well, they don't do that now, so it's whatever. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't affect me because I was never taught anything else contradictory. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting, like hearing your story about like hiding reading the Book of Mormon. I first opened a Book of Mormon when I was 9 years old. The missionaries like tracked it into my house. My mom took like a discussion or two with them and I sat in on them. And I remember that like I wanted my own Book of Mormon. I didn't have one, and like they didn't have an extra. And so they like, it came back around later that day to like drop off a Book of Mormon just for me. And I remember the missionary, his name was Elder Bell. I opened the door. He handed me the Book of Mormon. I took it from him. And then before he walked away, he winked at me. I was 9 and he was like 20, and I was like, had some feelings about that, being winked at by the missionary. Yeah, I remember that very distinctly. And then I started reading the Book of Mormon, and
at 9 years old? Mm-hmm. Did you even understand it?
No, not
like,
really.
That is hard language.
I mean, like my comprehension was like pretty good for a 9-year-old. And so I would say I had a hard time following like the whole narrative, which frankly can be confusing even like, as an adult. Because it's like big plates, little plates, these people, these weird names, whatever.
And then also there's this other group where we joined them into record.
Yeah, it's like confusing. And so I think I like didn't, like now that I've like read it many times as I'm much older, like I didn't have a good concept of like the overall narrative. Mm-hmm. But when it came to like, if I was just looking at like chunks of like a few verses at a time, then I could like, comprehend a few verses at a time. And I had this like yellow highlighter, and like as I was reading, and I'll be frank, I only made it like into like Second Nephi. I think I probably ran into the Isaiah chapters and was like,
you're like, I'm done.
Yeah. But I had my like a yellow highlighter, and it's going to sound crazy to everybody. Well, it's going to sound crazy to probably half of our listeners and totally expected to the other half, that when I read a verse or like a set of verses that made me get this like feeling inside, I would highlight it. I would mark it. And like at that point in my life at like 9 years old, I was not in the practice of writing in books, right? But I just like would get these feelings sometimes. And then whenever I was like having a hard time, which as I was like a pretty tormented child, just like mental health wise, just I don't know, like my like mental health issues like started pretty young. I would like go back, open up my Book of Mormon and like read through those highlighted parts, and then I'd always feel like really comforted. Like I'd always feel better.
Did you ever talk to your parents about that stuff? Because you mentioned like before we started that your mom was really New Age, your dad was an atheist, so like, did you ever talk to your parents about like, hey, I really liked what I read in this book? Like, not religiously, I liked that it gave me good feelings. Did you talk to anybody about that, or did you just like keep that to yourself?
I kept it to myself entirely. And when I was, so like I'm, like everyone knows, like I'm disaffiliated basically now at this point. But like the whole time I was active in the church, like I told that story a lot because it feels really compelling, right? Because I was like...
At 9 years old, I knew.
Yeah,
I wasn't even baptized yet.
Yeah, and like nobody was watching me. Nobody knew what I was doing. Nobody was telling me. Nobody was saying to me, read this book, you're going to get good feelings that you can go back to, right? Like I just had that experience. And to be honest, like looking back, like I did have that experience a little bit with like other books, especially like other like spiritual or religious books, but like none of them were like to the same degree. Like that one for sure stands out, right? And so like when it comes to, you know, because people will often say about converts, like, you know, they're joining because of like the social pressure, or, you know, it's just like someone is really selling it to them and like just like telling them the good parts or whatever. But that was just like me in a book having that experience.
Yeah.
And I didn't end up joining until I was like 16, when I like made some like LDS friends and like the missionaries came back around. But that experience I had starting from the time I was like 9 years old, and it was probably like from the time I was like 9 to like 12 that I was like interacting like with the Book of Mormon in this way, that I could sort of like go back to that and like tell myself, no, it wasn't just because someone's trying to sell it to you. It wasn't just, you know, you joining a church because you wanted to have friends. Like you were having these experiences, these like real emotional experiences when it was just you and when you were just a little girl.
So when, I might be getting ahead of myself here, but when you did join the church, like when you were baptized and stuff, and then as you lived your life, and then as you like started your faith crisis, and then you were like on your way out, did you ever go back to that moment and be like hold on to like, no, I need to hold on to the things that I know are true, and I know that that experience was from God? Or like how did that first experience fit in?
Yeah,
because I have my experience with like holding tightly to those initial spiritual experiences, but I'm curious to hear yours, and then like where you're at with it now.
Yeah, so when you were kind of mentioning like telling in your story about how like kind of like getting to a place of just like realizing that like you don't know right now, and like you don't know like when you'll know, and sort of it sounded like God, like feeling like you and God were good even if you like didn't know these things. So when I joined the church, I was sitting in a sacrament meeting while I was investigating, and the missionaries had said to me like, you know, because they were wanting me to like pray to know if I should join the church, that like I could like try like praying during sacrament meeting, because that can be like a kind of like a reverent quiet spiritual time or whatever. And I remember sitting in the sacrament meeting and praying to know, and like asking God, like, should I join the church? And I got this answer that was so clear. Well, I think I was saying like, God, like, is this church true, or is this church right? And I feel like what God said to me was like, it doesn't matter if it's true. You should join either way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And that was like, okay. And so I think like, you know, like that. And I think that like looking back on that, was that really God? I don't think so. I think it was just like my own my own deep intuition, recognizing something that was good in front of me. But I don't really get caught up on like, was that just God, or like, was it like my own mind? Right. Like,
right.
I feel like either way it was powerful, and I think it was right.
So are you someone who believes that like especially with your mom being more new age, are you someone who believes that like you just have to go through certain things, like there are certain lessons you have to learn in life? Or are you just kind of like, whatever, like, you know, life happens?
I would say I'm like a little bit more, probably a little more like life happens, you know, like I don't really feel like that there's things that like experiences that we like have to have, you know, or that like there's like a plan. I think that the plan is mostly like the plan that we make for ourselves. And I think that that was like me kind of like making the plan for myself. And as far as like incorporating those, like all of the spiritual experiences I've had, but especially that like one of like when I was 9, it's like, well, that sounds pretty powerful and pretty compelling. And for a long time, that's kind of what I used to like remind myself and like show other people, like, this is really true. This is really real. Like how I relate to that at that point. And the way I see it is that I have like a metaphor for it, which is that I was like playing in a sandbox, and like that experience was like me building a sandcastle. And it's like, it's real sand. It's really right in front of me, but there are like walls to this little sandbox that I was in. And that as I've gone through like deconstruction and like deconversion, what's happened is that like those walls of that sandbox have been picked up. And I've realized that I'm actually on like a huge expansive beach with like tons of sand and like an ocean. And so, and that there's like people all around me, like building their own sandcastles.
I actually really love that metaphor. I really love that.
And so it's like that sandcastle was always real, and it is like still real. But now that like what I'll call like the barriers to what I used to, in a way, like only allow my spiritual experience to be, or the barriers of what I allowed myself to believe about God, like picking those up and seeing like, oh, this is still real. This still really happened, but there's so much more context that it's not that it wasn't fake or wasn't real, but it's like now that I have more context and more understanding, I just like understand it differently than I used to.
I really love that. And I love that, like you said, when you take the barriers away and you see all the sand, like, look how much more you have. Like, look how much more sand you can grab to build your sandcastle.
Yeah, because like a sandbox is you're gonna run out of sand. Yeah. You know, you're gonna get to the bottom where you're like, oh, I'm just like at the dirt, right? Or I can only make this sandcastle so big. But I feel like removing the barriers, like lifting up those like little wooden sidewalls, and then realizing that there's like a whole beach there, and there's other people on the beach who are building their own real sandcastles, and you can like look around and be like, oh, what else is there? Yeah. So that's how I relate to it, that it's still real and it was still valid and important, but I've grown in the way I allow myself to like understand that experience.
That's really cool. And I like that. And I feel like that matches my experience to a degree, because it's like you have that barrier, but it's almost like for your safety and for other people's safety as well, that you have this barrier for you, because you're like, I'm only allowing what I can understand into my sandbox right now. But then you're older, you're like, okay, I can put my walls out, until eventually, I feel like you and I both have experienced this. You're able to just completely remove the barriers and just have all this information flood in. And then you don't have to take all the sand from the beach and put it into your sandcastle. You can take the sand that you want and leave the rest that you don't want.
Yeah.
So when I joined the church, I almost immediately went to the temple. When I was 19 years old. It was like I got baptized, and I think I had to wait like a month, but my bishop was like, yeah, let's get you into the temple. Like, you're going to love it. It's so great. And I want to hear about your experience. Had you ever been inside a temple before? Like, had you ever been to any open houses or anything like that?
Absolutely not.
Me neither.
Yeah.
Me neither. So I was shocked to go into, I went to the Manti Temple. That was the first time I ever did baptisms. And I remember being shocked. First of all, I was like, there's carpet here. And there's a water fountain in the corner and a computer. Like, there's modern technology. There's showers. Like, I remember just being shocked, because in my mind, I was like,
did you pick like Solomon's temple?
Pretty much. I thought everything was like the scriptures had talked about. I thought it was just gold everything, and like stones and like jewels. And I was shocked.
Sounds very like
out.
Indiana Jones almost.
Yes, almost. Like, I've actually never seen Indiana Jones either.
I actually
like,
haven't
don't
either.
get after me,
but I've been on the ride.
Yeah. So, but I remember being so surprised, like the modernity, is that a word of it? I remember being so shocked. And then when I went into the baptismal font and I saw the 12 cows, the 12 oxen holding it up, I was like, this is so cool to me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've been into the Manti Temple, but the Manti Temple is covered with murals, hand painted murals, just gorgeous paintings. And I remember being really fascinated by that too. And there was like a depiction of a baptism in there. And I was like, this is so cool. And then I stepped in the water with my socks on and I was like, this is so gross. Like, I hate being in this thick Carhartt style jumpsuit, essentially, that is white. And I'm wearing so many layers to stay like modest and appropriate, you know? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I hate this. This is disgusting to me. But it was just all the like the physical things of it. But it like the actual ordinance itself was so cool to me. I was like, how exciting is this? Because I'm the only member in my family. Mm-hmm. I was like, how exciting is this that like I get to have this experience for myself and I get to have it like with my roommates, the people who'd been there with me. Mm-hmm. So that was my experience with the temple. And I didn't know at the time, I hadn't heard of anything that had gone in the temple other than baptisms for the dead. Like I remember, I shared this in my first episode. I remember like in 6th or 7th grade, hearing my classmates talk about doing baptisms for the dead. I was like, you baptize dead people?
Yeah, sounds weird.
Like you pull them out of the ground and you baptize them? They're like, no. Like we just take their names. I was like, that's still weird. Like it is so weird and it is so foreign. But until you actually do it and like you learn to understand it, it's still weird. Mm-hmm. But like it makes sense if you actually believe in the theology of it. Like, oh, like this person didn't get the chance to receive the gospel in their life. They didn't get the chance to have these saving ordinances. So how awesome is it that I get to do it? Even though it's weird and, you know, it doesn't make sense. So what was your experience with the temple?
So honestly, like my first experience doing baptisms was like pretty, let's use the word unremarkable, not in like a bad way, but like my first time was in the Redlands, California temple, which is like, I feel like opposite of Manti because it's like very small and also very new. Whereas Manti has that like
so
old feel to it. Yeah. And like the one thing I remember was really like that stood out to me was that I accidentally went into the men's changing room, which like, you know, in the temple, they like keep you so modest, like nothing crazy happened to them. Sorry, so popular. But that I went to like the men's changing room and I was there like, you know, with my like youth group, I guess, the young men's and young women's. I was a Laurel at that age. I was 17 probably, and then the bishop's daughter who was like 12, she like chased after me. I was like, Juliet, no,
that's so cute.
So I remember that, but luckily did not see anything inappropriate in the temple that day. And like thinking about like the experience of like getting into the warm water with your jumpsuit, you know that feeling of the jumpsuit kind of like bubbling up as you get in. I love that feeling. I feel like it feels so good. I love the feeling of like the warm water in the jumpsuit.
It was, to me, the water is warm. It's not like cold, but it's not like a hot tub either. And I think that's what like icked me out. I was like,
it's lukewarm.
It's this weird like lukewarm. It's not enough for me to feel comfortable in it. And actually, like sometimes the water would get cold because like you're dunked and you're up and you're in the air and it's cold in there. Mm-hmm. And then you're in this thick jumpsuit that's clinging to your body and it's cold. And I'm like shivering by the end of it.
Were you ever told that you shouldn't do baptisms if you were on your period?
No.
I wasn't either. Apparently,
is that like a thing?
Apparently a lot of people were. Yeah, you're told that like you shouldn't do that because then you might. It's dumb. But yeah, apparently that's the thing. People should comment if they were told that.
I'd like to hear that experience. The one thing I was told in the temple in terms of like a temple worker telling me like, oh, you shouldn't do this. This is, like I said, I'd never been spiritually traumatized or had any spiritual problems with the temple. I had physical problems in the temple. My husband and I were married. I'm a convert, remember? So we weren't sealed yet. We had to wait 1 year for my baptismal date for us to be sealed and everything. So we were married. I think we'd been married for like 3 or 4 months, and we had a scheduled date night. Every single Thursday we went to the temple and we did baptisms. Mm-hmm. And we were married, and my husband was endowed, and so he had gotten like his special endowed undergarments for the baptism, but I had not received mine yet. And one of the male temple workers was like, you know, you really shouldn't be here. And I was like, what? He's like, no, like, you're married. You're not supposed to be doing baptisms. Like, that's supposed to be for the youth. Like, you guys need to be doing the grown-up stuff. You need to be doing the sealings and the initiatories. And I'm like, I'm not, like, we're married, but I'm a convert to the church. Like, I can't do that because I'm not endowed. I haven't done any of that yet. So I can't. I have like 60 more days to go or whatever. And then he's like, oh, and he just walks off. And I'm like, that's what you get.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
That's what you
now,
get for assuming. Like, oh my gosh, I was so bothered by that. But that's something that continues to bother is there's this, everybody's shoulding on everybody. Like, you know better. You're supposed to do this or you should do this. And it's like, I'm literally at this moment doing the absolute best that I can because this is all I'm allowed to do right now. Like, I've not even been a member a year. Like, we were so close.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I was a temple worker for a year. And that, like, I was a temple worker, like, during my faith crisis because I was like, the temple is the place that we are taught in many places that it is the only place that God can talk with you, the only place on earth that God can commune with you. And that is an incorrect teaching. That is so incorrect. But I was like, I have questions and I'm going to get some answers. So I'm going to go be a temple worker. And it was after the Manti Temple had been remodeled. And if you didn't know, initiatories, you would go into different rooms for the initiatory. The Manti Temple, after their remodel, was one of the only temples in the world who kept the initiatory in one space. You were in like a closet, essentially, and they had everything that you needed, but it was you and the two ladies that you were with, or two men, I assume, for men. And I actually loved doing initiatories. I thought it was the most beautiful thing. I felt so at home doing initiatories. I thought it was so amazing that I, as a woman, was able to use my priesthood power given from God to be able to bestow these wonderful blessings upon other people. But even during that time, it actually caused some other questions for me because I'm like, with some of the blessings that we're blessed with in the temple, I'm like, hang on. I know really faithful people who are amazing members and they're so Christ-like and they're not receiving the blessings that they were promised in the temple. And that caused like a whole other thing for me. But I loved being a temple worker. And it's like, I see the temple as everybody who's going into it believes that they are doing a really good thing. So in my mind, like, it is a net positive place because everybody who's going into it believes they are doing good. And so it's going to be a good place. And you hear stories of people all the time of being like, oh, what's that building? It feels so good. Like, I want to go inside. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so for me, I have a really hard time understanding when people are like, no, that place is evil. It feels so bad. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of like, I want to know more about why you feel that way, though, because, again, I have never experienced any spiritual negativity there. It's only been positive. So it's really curious to me when people are like, no, it was like the worst thing ever. Like, we see the temple clothing and it makes sense why people call that we're in a cult. I'm like, well, you're not wrong, but
yeah,
it's weird. It's weird. But like, you know, there's the apologetics of like, oh, it's similar to like a nun wearing a habit or like wearing I think it's called a hijab, or like it's just other ceremonial, sacred, special clothing.
Yeah.
So
I felt like, so like my first time doing baptisms was like pretty unremarkable. I feel like my first time like going through the temple, which like someone on Facebook asked, like, what was your first impression of like the temple ceremonies? And I think that's like a really interesting question. And for me, I felt like it was like kind of weird, but also the thing is like I kind of like expected it to be weird and like I've had people like friends who were raised in the church tell me that they feel like I was way less weirded out by the temple than they were. And I think part of that is because for me, kind of like all of Mormonism is new and weird, especially like growing up outside of Utah, like it is different, right? And so like I expected it to be different. And also I feel like I was prepped really well. Like my temple prep teacher was like someone that I was just really, really close to. And I feel like he did. So there, like he was my temple prep teacher, and then like his wife is actually like a really good friend of mine and was my escort. And so like before I went, like she showed me like all of her garments. She even like pointed out the marks and kind of like said what they meant, which I'm like, I don't know if like you're actually supposed to do that which like obviously like I don't have a problem with it because I think it was like helpful, but she showed me like all of her temple clothes like right in front of me.
Yeah.
And so like I feel like that was like a good prep. And then like as like in my temple prep class, he even like asked all of us like which temple we were going through, and like kind of like told us as much as he could about like the individual temple to kind of like prep us for our experience. Like, oh, this room you go to like this room, or this temple you go to like this room and then this room and then this room, or like, oh, in this temple you do like most of the stuff here and then you go here.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And so I felt like I had people kind of telling me as much as they felt like they could, which is really
like
a
of
lot.
like the physical process of it. And I feel like that's where there's been a big disconnect, where people are like, oh, it's sacred, not secret. Like, you can talk all day long about what it is. There's just certain things that really are sacred, and you keep those to yourself, and you can talk about them in the temple.
Yeah.
But I feel like I had a similar experience. Like, my temple prep teacher was amazing. She also showed me the garments, but also like I was married. I saw my husband's garments. I did his laundry.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, well, I can't wait to get my own, you know? But she showed me all the temple clothing as well, which I thought was so helpful. They're like, this is the apron. This is the robe.
This is
like
the veil.
This is the veil. And she's like, and there's different options for veils. Like, you can get the one that's elastic on your head, or you can get the one that's like a headband. I'm like, I'll probably just get the one that's a headband, I guess. Like, I don't know. But that was kind of hard too, is because I didn't have a close family member that I felt comfortable going shopping for underwear with, and how is it supposed to fit and stuff. So I had my mother-in-law, who was super, super, super sweet. But it was just like, it just wasn't that cute little bonding moment that I feel like a lot of, you know, kids get to have with their parents who grow up in the church. So I feel like I missed out on that as well. But now, like, after my faith crisis, I don't even know if I'll have that experience with my daughters either, you know, like whether that's my decision or whether that's their decision, I don't know. Well, I guess we'll reach that bridge when we get there. But I like that you were so well prepared. And I agree with you on the sense of like the people, my friends who grew up in the church, was like, that was so weird. And I'm like, all of it is weird. Like, what are you talking about? All of it is weird. Why are you so surprised about this specifically? Did the temple that you were in, did you watch the video? Okay, so the temple that I went to, Mount Tai, at the time,
it was live.
They were still doing live sessions, and
you're like, why are Adam and Eve 85 years old?
So old. Why is Satan like the cutest old man I've ever seen in my life? He's adorable. No, but we went back, you know, all the time. You're supposed to go as often as you can. There are times in the temple where watching it live was so amazing. Like, the spirit was so strong. And sometimes the workers would break character and they would start crying because they felt like so strong. They felt so deeply the words of what they were saying, and it made the session like so much more powerful. It was so cool. So like, I am really butthurt that they got rid of the live sessions, because I thought they were amazing.
Yeah, I was a temple worker in Salt Lake for like a year.
Did you like that?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
Because I hated the Salt Lake temple. Everything felt like, you know, where in the Manti temple, we're very lax. We're very
a little
chill.
slower.
It's not a worldwide like tourist destination, you know, like the Salt Lake temple is.
Yeah, for sure. Especially because like I mean, there's like an interesting contrast, because I worked like the 10 a.m. to like 4 p.m. shift on Saturdays in the Salt Lake temple, which meant that we had so many weddings. And I'm sure that if you like, and from the outside, I'm sure it looks like a bit of a, like, what's the word? Like in a factory, not a construction line, not a concession line. What's the word?
I know what you're talking about.
Like
a production line.
Yeah, like I feel like it starts with a C, like you guys know what I'm talking about, where you're just like, it's like you have like one part and you're just like moving it along, and I would say it looks like that on the outside. And to be frank, when you're I don't think it feels like that so much once you're on the inside for people going through the ordinance, but for sure, like as a temple worker, when you like know, when you're like on the part where like the sausage gets made and you know the lists of people getting married, and it's like, okay, and like how everyone's on a schedule, it's like, okay, like this couple's going to be here at 10 and then they're going to be here at 10:15. And
so were you a bride guide, or where?
Yeah, so I was like what they called an escort. So I would like pick up I would pick up like
you'd pick up the bride
right at the front. I would like walk the couple to like the recorder to get
all the paperwork,
and then I would like take them down, kind of like hand off the like the groom to like a temple worker, and then like if she was going through for like, so like sometimes I would like, well, I guess no, by that time they would have like had their ordinances done typically. But then I would like give her, like take her to the bride's room, like make sure that she had like her clothing on correctly, like take everyone up to like the ceiling room with their guests and kind of like help like escort like get everyone like off the floor, like do it timely, shush people, a lot of shushing
stressful.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worked in the bridal suite. Like that was my place. So I worked pretty closely with a lot of the escorts. So because I would help get the brides ready, and you're right, there's a lot of shushing. Well, they're just so excited and they look so beautiful in their dresses. And it's a fun time, but it's, you know, we got to keep that peace, keep that reverence, and
I think
loud laughter.
I think a lot of brides feel some, I think especially ones that haven't, because like, well, I mean, I never ended up getting married in the temple at all, but like I, you know, like went through the temple for my mission, then was a temple worker. So I spent like tons of time in the temple, and then like as a temple worker, did lots of ceilings.
And that was in Salt Lake then?
It was mostly, there was like some in Salt Lake, but then I also spent time in like California. So I spent kind of like time at different temples. And so like if I had ended up like getting married in the temple, I would have had like a very clear idea of like how it works and like would have known what to expect. But I think like a lot of brides, especially the ones that like get, you know, endowed like right before they get married.
Yes.
And then go and are
0-10. Do I recommend that, by the way? Like receive your endowment like a couple days before, because if you receive your endowment and then you get sealed, that is so much overload of temple information. And I feel like it can lead to a bad temple experience.
Oh, I think it does for a lot of people.
So I feel like, so that's what I was heavily suggested to. My temple prep teachers were like, try to schedule your endowment, receiving your endowment like a day or two before. So I received my endowments on a Wednesday, and then we were sealed that Saturday. And I feel like I'm so grateful to them because it was a much better experience.
Yeah. I also think that like your endowment, the way that for a long time it was just like, you know, the woman would like do the initiatory, get endowed, and then get sealed. Like I feel like your endowment deserves its own attention, and your wedding to your partner also deserves its own attention.
I completely agree, because you and I might be able to agree on this, because correct me if I'm wrong, did you ever struggle with your place as a woman in the church? Did you feel like a second-class citizen?
Not really.
Okay.
I do now, kind of. Okay. And I think that I probably I did a little bit like subconsciously, but I always like really just reached for like making it make sense to myself, or sort of like explaining it away, kind of. But keep going. Say what you're going to say.
So, because I have a lot of friends who have felt that way. I have never felt that way, but I sympathize for those that do. But I completely agree with you, where I feel like your endowment is your endowment for you personally. And there could be some argument against that. We're not getting into that. But I feel like your ceiling is you and your partner. So I feel like if you go in as, you know, I'm going in as Stevie, this is between me and this is between God. My endowment is, I am receiving an endowment of the priesthood from God. This is mine. And then to go from that to immediately, well, now I'm being sealed to my husband. And, you know, with some of the wording, it can be a little confusing to think like, oh, I have to go through my husband to God now, where my endowment was between me and God. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I completely agree with you. I think it is really important that if, you know, everything allows, if your life allows, do your endowment first and then be sealed to your spouse. Yeah. You know, even a day later, like you can wait 24 hours and I promise you will have a better experience. We are almost out of time, but there was a couple things you specifically wanted to talk about. So what did you want to talk about?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I feel like we have talked so much about the temple, which is great. And we probably need to do more episodes because there's so much to say.
So much.
You know, there's like the whole
good,
like
the bad, the ugly.
There's so much like, is it sacred or is it secret? And honestly, I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's okay to admit. One thing that I wanted to just kind of touch on, like as far as the convert experience, is temple. I think is really important. Then also things, a little bit of like polygamy and a little bit of like racial restrictions, like just those things that. Some really uncomfortable parts of like church history and church culture, because those are things that like when people leave, I think they're often like
they're like shelf breakers.
Yeah. And so it's like, how could somebody join like how could somebody put themselves into this, especially as like an adult or like an older teenager? Like how could someone choose this for themselves? And I think with as far as polygamy, this is like a little bit silly. I actually talk about this a little bit on our Ben Park episode. But yes, I did know that polygamy was practiced when I was baptized. I did know that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy when I was baptized. But I just kind of imagined that like Joseph Smith, I imagine that like 1830 was closer to like 1000 BC than it was to like present day.
Like it felt so far away. In the past. Yeah. They don't do it now. It was so far away.
Yeah. And I was like, who knows what the heck they were doing back in the 1800s. And I realize now like how faulty that is, but I just kind of explained it away to myself as like, number one, it was a long time ago and they did all kinds of crazy stuff a long time ago. And of course,
like
we don't
medicine.
Like we don't have to do it now.
Right.
And I was pretty confident that like that wouldn't be asked of me. And then also just like I was having so many positive experiences in the church and I felt like there are things that I went from not understanding to understanding, that I just kind of like had faith that like it would get understood eventually. So I would say like that's like how I dealt with polygamy.
So was your like introduction to polygamy, was that only through the lens of the LDS church?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I would say, and it was through like, I don't know, like when I first learned that like Mormons had practiced polygamy, but it was before I even started investigating. Like it was just like a cultural thing. Like I knew that it was something that had happened, but I also knew that it wasn't something, at least in like the mainstream LDS church, wasn't practiced currently. And like all the LDS families that I knew were just like so normal, you know? So I didn't really feel that relevant, I guess.
So did the missionaries teach you that like, oh, you know, we believe that, you know, when we die, we're going to be sealed and
eternal polygamy?
Like eternal polygamy. Like, were you taught that?
Absolutely not.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So growing up in Utah, I knew a ton about polygamy. Like I remember being so confused that my friends didn't know Joseph Smith was a polygamist, because we literally spoke about that in my public school education unit on like the pioneer polygamy, like people crossing the plains. I had 2 descendants of Brigham Young in that class alone. Their names were Whitney and Peyton, and they were cousins. And
Whitney and Peyton being cousins in Utah, it just sounds like the most Utah cousin-y names.
Well, and their last name's Young, even. Like, literally, like, they are direct descendants from this guy. And so they were able to share, like, oh, yeah, he's my however many greats grandfather on this side with this wife specifically. Like, they knew their history. And I think it's because their parents were proud. They were proud to have that polygamous ancestry. Some people are not proud to have that. I really don't care, to be completely honest with you. But I feel like I have such a unique perspective when it comes to polygamy, because my very first boyfriend ever, my first serious boyfriend, came from an immediate polygamous family. He wasn't like the FLDS family, but he came from, you know, an offshoot of it. And they very strongly believed that Joseph Smith, that the priesthood died with Joseph Smith. They didn't believe that it was passed to Brigham Young and is the church now today. And so I have a very unique perspective on polygamy. I was able to sit down and talk with many wives and many of the girls and the cousins who wanted to practice polygamy even today. And I personally, I could not do it. I'm telling you right now, I couldn't do it. But the way that they believe it to be, they truly believe it is the celestial law. They truly believe in the divinity of multiple women being married to one man. And it doesn't make sense to me, but the ones who like truly try to practice it in the most high spiritual law way possible, I'm like, I feel like you're doing it right. But at the time, my boyfriend, when he told me that he came from a polygamous family, the whole FLDS child bride thing had happened like 2 years ago. So I was like, child brides. And he's like, no. Like that's whack. That's the crazy offshoot. You're going to find them everywhere, you know? But he's like, we really do believe in like celestial law. And I actually have friends who are polygamous and they truly believe in it. So to me personally, I don't believe in it, but I also don't believe that God is going to force you to practice polygamy, because that goes against the number one gift he gave us, which was agency to choose. So that's personally where I'm at with polygamy, but I know it's really, really, really hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? Like it's so hard, because it's like I have this immediate experience of seeing it done in a way I don't agree with, but in a way that doesn't seem to be like actively hurting individuals. Does that make sense?
It does.
Where like, you know, in the FLDS, whatever his name is,
Warren Jeffs.
Yes, that guy.
Yeah.
They were actively harming and hurting people. And I read countless biographies from people who had escaped polygamy. So I feel like I've seen both sides of it where I have a different opinion on it.
Yeah.
But also I believe that like I'm going to use my gift of agency to choose.
And you're not going to choose polygamy.
And I'm not going to choose polygamy.
Yeah.
Like I am selfish and my husband's is all mine. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think, have you read Sister Wife by Christine Brown?
I love the Sister Wives. It's a guilty pleasure.
I do too.
I actually trained. I was a personal trainer, and I actually trained Mary's sister for a long time.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
But have you read that book? Have you read Sister Wife? Okay, I love that book because I feel like it might be helpful for people who are in the church. Like even I'm thinking like active, faithful people in the church who really struggle with that element of church history, not because like I do think that polygamy, I don't think in general it was good for women in our church in the past. I think that there's like a lot of issues with it. But one thing I loved about that book is that she just shows so much of like the things that she thinks is wrong with polygamy, at least the way that like her sect practiced it, but also the reason why it was good for her and good for her family, especially like as a child.
Even though they all ended up divorcing him, I liked that she could still say like, this was a good thing about it. I liked that duality.
Yeah. And that's not to say that I think that people should I'm not
endorsing.
Yeah. I'm not like, here, go like figure this out. But I think, like one thing that is really important to our podcast is that we try to understand one another. And I feel like if we just look at polygamists, and especially if we just look at polygamous women and just say like, like they're brainwashed, they're controlled, whatever, just like people will do when like looking at converts, like, oh, they joined because like they're brainwashed,
they're
controlled.
They're so naive,
right?
And coerced.
And like not hearing their own perspective and like the ways that it made sense for them and like the ways that it works for them, then like that's just like an act of like dehumanizing somebody, right? Because like, of course, like in all of our choices, like there are some ways that, like we are persuaded, we are coerced, or maybe we don't have like complete control. But also like there's elements where we're like very much choosing for ourselves, even if that's like joining the LDS church or being polygamist, that are like real and valid, that I think often people, especially people who are like have deconstructed, who are like criticized, who are like critical of the church or of like other sects like outside of the mainstream church, are like somewhat dismissive of.
And I agree with you. I feel like this is so interesting though too, because I feel as a convert, I feel like I will never be good enough to be like, I feel like I will never have made it, even though I've done everything. I have done everything. Like I was an ordinance worker in the temple, and in my personal opinion, that is as high as a woman in the church can get. Like that is higher than being Relief Society president. That is higher than being, Stake Relief Society president, general authority, whatever. Like
it's powerful.
That is, and being an ordinance worker in the temple as a woman, that is the highest place to be, in a position of power where you're actually practicing your priesthood power that we're endowed with. And I just completely forgot where I was going with that.
But you feel like you'll never.
Yes. I feel like even though I was in that position, I feel like I will never be good enough because I'm a convert, ever. I feel like there will always be some kind of like polarizing thing keeping me away from being in.
Like, being the Mormon woman.
Yes.
Like I felt like I was always kind of like, sort of like eccentric a little bit. And, even though totally active, totally worthy, leadership callings, temple worker, missionary, seminary teacher, blah, 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 blah. But like, there was something about me that was just like a little bit different. And now looking back on it, and I realize we need to like close this up, but looking back on it now, thinking about especially like my experience with like dating, that I feel like that probably like really like knocked me down, because I feel like I probably like didn't like fit the mold. I feel like people maybe saw me as like being a little bit of a risk, which I left the church now, so I guess I was. They were probably all right.
They clocked you from the beginning.
They knew. It was obvious. They were like, that girl's on her way out. But
yeah. And I don't know. And I think of it as a blessing now that I have like deconstructed and I'm working on reconstructing my faith. I think it's a good thing though, really, because I feel like it has allowed me to understand that like my want and my desire to be wanted by other people, to be included, for me personally, is from God. Like he will always want me no matter what. He will always want me to want him no matter what. And he will always accept me, you know, where I feel like I can do everything to a T and be the most perfect Mormon ever, poster child. And I will somehow still never be good enough in one way or another. So I feel like for me, just knowing that God accepts me completely as I am, and I learned that with my reconstruction, was like mind-blowing to me. And so now that I'm still a member of the church, I consider myself active, even though people have told me I'm not because, you know, I don't follow the word of wisdom, I don't wear my garments and a whole other things. They're like, you're not an active member. Like, I feel like I'm still active though. But I feel like it is a good thing though too, because even though I'm choosing to stay in, I hope that I can be that person for other people. I hope people understand that, like, no matter what, like you can sit next to me. Yeah. We can sit by each other.
Yeah, I love that.
We can be together, because I understand to a degree where you're coming from, feeling othered, feeling on the outside, because I always feel that way. So if I can make you feel just a little bit included, that's my goal with staying in the church.
Yeah, and there are going to be people in the church and out that say, if you're doing it the way you're doing it, if you're drinking coffee, if you're not wearing your garments, if you're like whatever, like opting out of temple attendance, that you're not really doing it.
Right.
But I feel like if there's enough people who aren't really doing it, like eventually we'll just make the tent bigger. You know,
I agree,
like it just needs people to do it. And yeah, so I love like the example that you're being of just like having the autonomy and like looking up to God for your permission.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of like looking side to side.
Well, and that's really the only place diagonal. You need to look. I agree with you.
Yeah.
This has been such a wonderful conversation, but unfortunately we are out of time.
We're out of time.
And we didn't even get to all of our questions.
We're not even
they were
close.
so good.
Also,
we have so many questions.
Look at this merch, y'all. I got this shirt yesterday. Thank you to Whitney, Mitch's wife, for getting me this shirt. We'll put a link in our bio, but everyone should get these.
It's actually already in there because I looked when you shared about it in your story.
So, it's already there. Yes, obviously. I knew that. I was testing you.
I passed.
You passed the test. But please like, subscribe, share, support if you can. Follow us on Instagram.
Please leave your opinions in the comments. Please tell us of your experiences in the temple. If you're a convert and you've stayed, or you're a convert and you've left, please let us know about your continued experience. I would personally love to hear it.
Yeah, for sure. And if you follow us like on Instagram and don't follow Stevie, follow Stevie. If you follow Stevie and don't follow us, then what are you doing? Follow us. Okay. I think that's all.
Cool.
Okay. Take care. Bye, everybody.